Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 2 years, I've interviewed over 150 people around this question, not to provide you with the universal answer, but to help you find and define your own answer to this question. While I'm also trying to share with you what I perceive to be more genuine expressions of the human experience. On the 22nd episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, I'm joined by Craig Slee. Craig is a disabled writer, consultant, and theorist, dealing with mythology, magic, and culture, and exploring life through the lens of landscape, disability, and fugitive embodiments. He has contributed essays and poetry focusing on the numinous and disability to various anthologies, and he has also co-facilitated numerous series at the Dresden Academy for Fine Arts, including one on Ableism and arts in 2022. In this episode, Craig takes us on a journey from burning out from trying to be, in air quotes, normal, to exploring other ways of being and existing, to developing a greater awareness regarding the subtleties of life, pain, and suffering, and ultimately to discovering vitality and aliveness in living his own good life. There's plenty to take from this episode in terms of guiding you to pay attention, developing a more subtle awareness, and the significance in our inquiries of sensing the world as it is without labeling it, and what all this may lead to in terms of finding new ways of being. And if you enjoy this conversation on this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe and leave reviews, as I'd greatly appreciate your support at this stage of my podcasting journey. So without further ado, the 22nd episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Craig, thank you very, very much for joining me on the What is a Good Life today. This is a conversation I was very much looking forward to after our previous conversation together.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's great to have a conversation with you previously and today. So there we go.
Wonderful. So, Craig, as I tend to start these off with the question of what question are you trying to answer as you move through life?
I think the biggest question I'm trying to answer is what's going on that we don't notice? What's going on in our lives, in our existences, in our relationships with other beings, human and otherwise, that we're just not noticing at all. And I think that very much ties in with my own lived experience as somebody with a lifelong disability. And it raises a lot of questions for me as a person who is wondering about assumptions that are made, that we all make, that everybody makes about what life is.
That's a beautiful investigation in terms of what aren't we noticing, and just how kind of prevalent that is in relationships as well. How does your specific lens then through your experience with lifelong disability, can you kind of share with us
Sure. So
experiences from that perspective?
A little bit of background. I was born with cerebral palsy, and I use a wheelchair. And in 2017, I also became a partial amputee due to some medical problems. And one of the things that I experienced throughout my life, in good and bad ways, is people trying to make me, through surgery and through experience, have as, quote, normal an experience as possible. You know, make things accessible, make things inclusive, all the wonderful words and good words that we use for disability, diversity, equity and inclusion, all these things. And I got to, must have been my late 20s, and I burnt out completely trying to have that, normal, everyday experience, because it costs so much more energy for those of us who are configured differently, who have a different experience, to show up and try and ignore the things your body and your mind are telling you, which for other people they would have less problems, perhaps. Say, it costs me a lot of energy to get out of bed in the morning. For other people, it might be a simple thing that they do without thinking. For me, that takes a whole rigmarole. In my case, it actually takes at least one or two other people to help me out of bed in the morning, right? So this whole idea of a normal experience and trying to behave as if there is a normal experience that one should strive to, I kind of burn out on that, and it really caused me significant mental health problems at the time, because I was like, well, I'm burning myself out striving for this supposed thing that I should go for, that indeed my parents and my family sacrificed a lot for in order to let me have these so-called advantages. Throughout my youth, I had surgery so that I wouldn't be as disabled. I have physically been reconfigured in order that I would be more independent or more so on and so forth. And so all these points at which I hit the mental health low, and I was sort of sat there going, well, what is there? If I can't be that, what can I be? And that was when I started looking at my own experience, comparing it to the apparent norm, and going, okay, mine's different, but what is the norm assuming that isn't actually true for a lot of people, right?
Right.
What are they missing about what they consider ordinary? Is the ordinary actually fundamentally strange and weird, and we don't realize that? And that's my whole jumping off point.
Well, that's a beautiful point to jump off from, isn't it? I guess, like, just in terms then of your observations, what are you seeing that the ideas of the norm or the way people are looking at life, what do you see them missing?
I think one of the big things, and is this idea that we have around movement, activity, and autonomy, right? So a lot of the time, let's pick a purely hypothetical example here. If for some reason, say you were paralyzed or you couldn't get out of bed, right? The generalized assumption would be, okay, so if you're lying in bed, you're doing nothing, right?
Right.
But actually, if you think about all the things that your body is doing when you are, quote, lying in bed doing nothing, it's quite a lot. Your cells are dividing, your heart is beating, your lungs are inflating, all this is going on. And a lot of the time, people, particularly with, say, chronic fatigue or other disabilities, one of the horrible things that sort of happens is, why am I so tired? I'm not doing anything. And in many of these cases, your body is doing a lot of things. It's burning through a lot of resources, and that is why you are fatigued. That is why you're exhausted. But it doesn't look like you're doing anything from the outside, when actually your body is probably working harder than somebody who is probably going on a jog.
Right.
You see what I mean? So there's this whole assumption that activity has to be big and noticeable. And you can take that into the idea of activism. It has to be a big, giant political movement. It has to be a a big noticeable gesture, something that is recognizable. And one of the things that I have noticed in my life is some of the biggest changes, they happen from the smallest movements inside my own body, and taking that outside, the way a plant moves towards the sun, as an example. That is what we would consider a tiny movement. But that plant suddenly has so much more access to more sunlight because of that tiny movement. And we don't recognize it. So there's this whole idea that we exist in varying temporalities and experiences, various ways of living that we just don't notice,
Yeah.
And in that case, one of the biggest ideas that I took from my friend Bio, who you had on the podcast, is something that he said to me in conversation, which is disability is the failure of power to contain itself, right? And I take that to mean that there will always be overspill. There will always be things going on that we don't notice, right? That a human being who has a firm grip, shall we say, on their mug, which I've got here, but I won't put on the camera, isn't aware always of all the muscle movements in their wrists and their fingers, right? To them, it's a simple movement of the mug to their mouth, right? That's an outline, that's a standard movement. Nobody thinks about what's actually going on, the things that are spilling out into that situation. So there's always leakage, and disability for me is focusing on that leakage, that kind of thing that exists in spite of those norms. So the movements, the activities that happen, even though they don't fit the designation of activity or activism or things like that.
So it almost sounds, Craig, then like this, like are you cultivating like a very deep awareness of what other people may even just think the nuances or subtleties, but this is something that you like, that it can be truly felt more, or
Yeah, I would say, that you can. To me, there's a difference between sensing and sense making, right? So we spend a lot of our time experiencing stimuli and then trying to interpret that stimuli, right? Because, I don't know, I stick my finger in my tea. Ow, that's hot. I've recognized that's hot. That's all I need to know, right? Because, obviously, that hurt. We don't study our pain, right? Because we want to try and avoid it. But if you have a disability or something which gives you chronic pain, as I do, there's no escape from your pain. You can take a whole bunch of painkillers, but ultimately, it'll be back. So you have a choice. You can spend your entire existence trying to avoid it. And this isn't some, macho thing. This is, okay, what does my pain do to my body? In my case, when my chronic pain is bad, it literally alters the way I sit. It alters the way I think. It alters the way I move, all this stuff. And studying these sort of things, which we normally either don't notice or avoid, can change your consciousness a little bit. It can make you more aware of things that you are perhaps unaware of, or resources that you didn't even know you had. And that, to me, is one of the key points, is that there are resources and ways of being which people don't even know exist. And the people who do know they exist are the people who found them because they have no choice. They've had those experiences which say, actually, I had no alternative but to learn to exist in pain, or so on and so forth, and learned how to marshal my resources in a very particular way. And when you do that, when you start thinking about sensing the world, not immediately trying to interpret it, right? Just noticing what's going on. And rather than going, oh, that tree is waving in the breeze, and saying, hey, I've seen a tree that is waving in the breeze.
Yeah.
You actually look at the tree and you go, okay, something's going on there. And I'm not going to necessarily say, the tree is waving in the breeze. I'm just going to study that tree and the way it moves and the conditions. And this means that it leaks out of the idea of the human, right? It leaks out of the idea of life and agency belonging solely to the human and to the human individual, right? So you become aware of more interdependencies in your environment and with you. You become aware of, or in my experience, again, I can only speak from my experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
One can begin to become aware of how one occupies space and how space alters the way we think.
When you could you give me a sense of how you began to explore this experience? So even from, was this something that I know you said, look, it's almost you're brought to this situation because you're confronted with the pain, chronic pain. Can you give me a sense, though, was there I'm not looking for one moment, but because you even mentioned already, small little things happen and things build. But can you give me even a sense of how this shift started to occur for you in terms of how you'd study your pain, shall we say?
So the essentially the real shift began when prior to my amputation in 2017, I'd always had these feelings and these ideas. And prior to the amputation, I don't want to, gross your listeners out too much, but essentially the reason the amputation happened was because part of a limb started dying through various forms. And essentially, as that part of that limb dies, it hurts. It hurts a hell of a lot. You end up on morphine daily and that sort of thing. So there's actually no escape from the pain, and there are, times when you don't want to be here because you just don't want to hurt anymore. And one of the moments I realized in the midst of that was that the pain level wasn't actually constant, right? It shifted. It was still, to use a traditional pain scale, it was still a 10 at all the times. But actually, if I focused on it, I realized the 10 wasn't the same all the time, So I began to see ebbs and flows in my pain. Moments where it seemed not as intense, as painful, but not as intense. Or moments when perhaps it increased. And so this ebb and flow of something that by any given metric would say, oh, so you're saying it was less than a 10. No. No, it was just a different quality. And it becomes quality over quantity, if you like. We quantize the world rather than sensing its qualities. And that was the point for me where I was like, oh, okay. These things which we think are fixed experiences, they ebb and they flow and they shift and they change. Like a weather system. We say, oh, it's raining today, but actually the level of rain is not always constant. But we assume, oh, it's raining. There's a uniform level. And there isn't. In a more ecological sense, there's always these little shifts. And building on that sense of little shifts meant that when I was before sometimes screaming in agony, it was a case of it will change. It may not get better, but it will change. And this
too shall pass.
Yeah, but not pass in terms of go away. It will shift.
Yeah.
And one of the key things for me with dealing with disability is there is this assumption that if you are ill or sick or disabled, there's a trajectory where you become sick and then you get better, right? And as anybody with chronic illness or a lifelong disability or even a disability in later life will tell you, sometimes that doesn't happen. And the general narrative doesn't know what to do with that. Some people would say, oh, I'd rather be dead than be disabled, and I empathize with that feeling because they can't conceive of another way of existing, right? And so what I'm sort of wondering about outside of my personal experiences, what other ways of existing are there? What other agencies are there which are involved in our lives, which we're not noticing?
I love the sentiments of what other ways of existing are there, but there's one thing there's one thing you kind of said there in terms of how uncomfortable it is for people, or that they don't know what to do with this sense of, look, you have this arc, almost of sickness then recovery, and they don't know what to do with it. If someone has a long standing or a long life disability, how do you see, or how do you kind of observe society's struggle with that?
See, this is one of those points at which I'm gonna invoke an academic here, because the academic Fiona Kumari Campbell who has this set of theory that she calls studies in ableism, right? And one of the key points of this theory is that an ableist society, which is purely a society which favors those it regards as abled, right, requires there to be something to not be, right? So it creates this idea of disability and puts it at the bottom, right? It puts it at the bottom of a ranking system, if you like. And at the top of the ranking system are the totally autonomous, healthy, can do whatever they want, unencumbered by restriction people. And at the bottom of this ranking system, there are the people who are totally dependent on other beings that have no autonomy, that are not, in actual fact, worthy individuals, right? And everybody in an ableist society, so the theory goes, is trying not to be at the bottom, right? we're trying to be as autonomous as possible. And so when you deal with that ranking system, there's a lot of trying to flee from that position, and trying to get better, trying
Right.
to not have to rely on as many people. And there's a weird moral component to that, and when people hit that sort of point at which they're like, I'm not going to get any better, they don't know how to engage with what the conditions that they're under, right? And I think that the sticking with the conditions that we're under and studying them is the point that we don't, as a society, have a good way of doing. We're always looking for the next thing.
Yeah.
Right? And I think I've got a bit lost here. So if I'm not answering the question, then by all means.
No. So like I'm asking around the sense of, what is your interpretation of how society is almost struggling with this connection? You're telling me about this academic study as well,
Yeah.
or in terms of an ableist society, and almost the difficulty then in terms of like, okay, but at what point then does somebody just get comfortable with the fact that a situation isn't going to change, or we aren't going to get to complete this typical arc that we kind of we're more comfortable with?
Yeah, it's interesting you use the metaphor comfortable there as well, because I'm comfortable in my disability, but my disability brings me discomfort, right?
Yeah.
And there's this really interesting tension, because there is this idea that comfortableness is always the best thing, right? And I'm not saying, oh no, you should valorize your pain or your discomfort. What I'm saying is turning your face away from it because that's what society wants you to do. That's the problem. Because, for years, literally, there used to be, points where disabled people, you shut them away in an institution. They're out of sight, out of mind, because they raise the query of, okay, all this effort you're putting in to be like X, is it actually worthwhile if people can exist as Y? Right?
Yeah.
And so if we can't turn away, what do we do? If we can't turn away from climate change, what do we do? If we can't turn away from racism, what do we do? We want to get rid of them. And that's understandable and that's good. Just in the same way we want to ease pain and ameliorate suffering, right? But disability doesn't have to be suffering, right?
Yeah.
And in the same way, some of these studying and sensing practices that I'm talking about, and people will develop their own, but ultimately it comes down to refusing to take what is taken as read, if you like. So you look at the tree and you think, oh, the tree's standing there doing nothing, right? If you refuse to look at the tree as just a tree, as you know it, but say, actually, there's more going on here. Let's see what that is. In the same way, you're lying in the bed, seemingly do nothing, and you're actually saying, I'm not doing nothing. Something's happening here, right? So that whole trajectory, as regards disability and society going, oh, we don't want to be we don't want to be disabled. They're the bottom. They're the waste, right? We don't want to study our waste. We want to get it away from us, right? We don't want to look at the things that make us feel uncomfortable, right? And one of those things is we look at our sense of comfort and we sort of conflate it with ease, right? My life is not easy, you know? The lives of disabled people are not easy, sorry. But you can be comfortable in the sense that, or you can have comfort, rather. There can be comfort in your life. You can have laughter, joy, all the things that are regarded as a good life. They're not necessarily excluded from you, despite being from this class that the system sets up and goes, no, you can't have that, and you better be dead. And I was like, bullshit. Sorry, I'm not sure if I can swear, but
no, you can, yeah.
You know,
bullshit away, sir.
Yeah, but like, so there is this real sense for me that disability and sensing in this context are inextricably linked because, you know, metaphorically, the wound is an opening that allows us to see inside things, right? The discomfort says, ooh, maybe you should pay attention to this. And that's what pain is, really. Yeah. Pain is saying something is going on, right? You either need to get out of this situation that's causing you pain or change something, right?
Yeah.
And if you can't change something, you need to work out what's the best way to deal with your pain or your experience.
And I think what you're saying here is you're also touching on a lot of universal truths here.
Yes.
Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying something is absolutely one way or the other, but the sense of, I fully agree with you, this idea that comfort equals a good life. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, just in general, in whatever anyone's situation is. But also this sense of, like, we get so uncomfortable with pain or in the various contexts in which other people experience pain and discomfort in their lives. We really struggle with exploring that or looking at it. Like, and there's something you said, like, which I think almost tied into what you were saying at the start, but something along the lines of, like, what other ways are there to exist within this situation?
Yeah.
And I know you're talking about all this kind of, like, investigation into, or observation of the pain, really, because you're not trying to label it one way or the other. What other ways, like, when did you get like, it sounds like even a little bit more freedom in this, or an expanse within this, to even contemplate the idea of what are the other ways of existing right now?
Well, I think for me, I am, you know, amongst other things, I'm a writer, but I also engage in various forms of meditation and what you might even call magic or the occult or any of that stuff, which is all about what some academics might call rejected forms of knowledge, right?
Right.
So there are other ways of knowing and experiencing the world, and some of those involve, you know, using various breathing techniques or so on and so forth to alter your perceptions, so on and so forth. And the metaphor I always sort of use is the moment I learned to explore this sensually. So if you're like, you've got somebody who's stuck in a prison cell, right? And your first impulse for any prison cell, you know, mostly is to want to get out of it. You know, you're trapped. You don't want to be trapped. So you spend all your time trying to get out of the prison cell. That's understandable. But how do you get out of the prison cell if you don't know what the prison cell is? Right?
Right.
So in that case, you might feel the wall. You might look for any weaknesses, any cracks, any, you know, movements. in the brickwork. If there are no windows, you might be looking for airflow. So you have to become adept at sensing the space that you are in. And the moment you start sensing the space that you're in, the space changes, right?
Right.
It's not what you thought it was. There's always more to it. And when you start thinking about your experience as a very narrow, thing like that, right? And the whole of the world is outside of that. And there are things which are shaping the walls of the so-called prison cell that maybe you should pay attention to. Maybe you should pay attention to the things which seemingly are outside the idea of the individual. So maybe you should start paying attention to the food that you're eating. Not in some health way, but start observing, hey, when I eat this kind of food, my body behaves this way and this way. So in that sense, it's scientific, but it's not the kind of science that we normally invoke. There is this real call and response, because you're sat there, you're observing, and you're witnessing, but you're also participating. You're not some abstract figure just watching and taking notes in a lab somewhere. Because, to return to the prison cell metaphor, you're touching the wall and you're leaving your sweat. You're leaving the oil from your fingers on the wall, and you're picking up the bacteria from the wall. So all the way through, there is this profusion of others, influencing you. And what's one of the key things to me is realizing that actually what we would consider an ordinary state of consciousness isn't one state of consciousness at all. We're constantly moving between them. We're constantly moving between, how we're reacting. Some spiritual traditions would say we're dreaming. We're dreaming while awake. And if you've ever had a very vivid dream, you know that, dreams can shift and change. If you start to notice that shifting quality in your everyday life, then, things become less fixed, more fluid. Everything becomes flux. And in that flux, you can, if you can't go in a straight line, you can sail like a boat on the sea,
Right.
There are currents and flows. And you can set a course, right? But you have to acknowledge the currents and flows of the ocean. You can't just forge ahead and be like, yes, I'm the human, I can force my way through. No, you have to pay attention to the weather, to the currents, to the movements of things larger and different to yourself.
It seems like you've come into contact with just the vast universe that exists, either both internally, but then also outside of you as well. Like, and within this has been quite significant in your curiosity and your wonderment about the experience of life as well.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note as well that I'm not sure, and I don't mean in terms of hallucinatory experiences, but I'm not sure how we define internal and external anyway.
Very fair. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I'm literally not sure how, okay, we'll talk about the skin as the ultimate barrier, but your skin has pores. Like, I believe it's something like 1 to 2% of the respiration, a tiny amount, but respiration happens in the pores of your skin, right? It's not much compared to your lungs, but there is a porosity, to all of this, to every outline. There is a kind of porosity to everything. There is a sort of a fuzziness. And so if I'm not sure about what's internal and external, I then cannot say to myself, yes, I am ultimately in control, or I am the only one that matters. I can't be the only one that matters, because I'm not even one person. I'm this whole mess of everyone I've ever known, every piece of bacteria I've ever put in my body, millions of years of stuff like that. I have mitochondria, which decided to come in and eat another cell millions of years ago. We are always the others. So the question is of how are there other ways to be is always backed by what others am I, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. That's really nicely put. Look, one thing I never even, when we talked the last time, that you just mentioned at the end, and I mentioned to you briefly that I
Sure.
love Alan Moore, and you mentioned that you liked him too. When you mentioned the role of magic and the occult, because this isn't something that I've looked at too strongly in my own, whether you want to call it spiritual path or consciousness, or just observation of life, I guess, maybe even. Could you kind of give a sense of how that plays a role?
Sure. For me, and I'm going to use a term that I hate, but it is one that has some currency, and your listeners might know. I live in an animist universe, right? So stuff is alive and has influence to varying degrees, right? And when I say that occult stuff is rejected forms of knowledge, what I mean is, and apologies, I'm a recovering person with a recovering philosophy background here, right? So there are various ways of knowing. There are what are called epistemologies, and various different epistemologies exist. So the example that is always used is, that I quite like, is I can say I know maths, right? I know mathematics. But I can also say I know Mark. I'm using the same word, no, but they have two different qualities, two different kinds of propositional knowledge, right? And what the occult, in inverted commas, can mean for some is the study of the hidden experience of knowing, right? So you've picked Alan Moore, and Alan Moore is of the opinion that art is magic, that influencing people's consciousness through, writing, speech, whatever, is a form of magic. Despite the beard, I'm not totally, in agreement with
a loyal disciple. I thought you were going to
be. I'm very fond, and I have friends who are friends of his. But I would say for me that the occult, or any of this things that are associated with magic, is fundamentally about existing and prospering in a living cosmos, a cosmos where there are other influences, and whether one believes in gods or spirits or purely viruses that alter our entire society, studying those influences is what eventually became what we call science. There is the division between magic, occultism, science it's a very modern one. You know, the arc of history, if you like, if it has an arc, which I'm not sure about, is people paying attention to the world and working with the world as they experience it. And in doing so, learning things about the world and experiencing knowledge which might be considered irrational, right? But in that irrational knowledge, being able to pass that round down to generations. And so you might have a story of, say, you know, if you need this situation solving, use this herb, right? Or, you know, this is how you speak to the gods, by mixing these two vines together and brewing up some ayahuasca, right? We would, in our modern world, we would say, oh yeah, that's trial and error and, you know, scientific knowledge and repetition, and eventually that's how they got it. But what if you say that those people learnt the forest and they let the vines speak to them in whatever way that is, and in some fashion they learnt to fuse those two vines together to brew ayahuasca, which then gives them their experiences, which they then come back and tell their community, and perhaps that moves in a feedback loop. Because for me, what's interesting, and your listeners might be interested in some of the work by a fellow by the name of Peter Kingsley. One of his theses is that Western philosophy, which is sort of the basis of rationality as we, you know, have it, in its pre-Socratic form, involved, in many cases, going down into a dark cave and performing rituals and having mystical experiences, and then coming up and using those mystical experiences to explore the world and say, actually, we should behave this way and that way. So I'm with Alan Moore in the sense that I think magic is the basis of what becomes culture. Strange experiences then get rendered less strange and become part of how a culture responds.
So to me, then it sounds though like that it's, and I don't want to make something mythical or magical reduced to the idea of a tool, but if you excuse the definition, like it almost seems like another tool for trying to see the world for how it is, or using like, or it's almost like, for me, it sounds like we need to deconstruct the lenses that we're viewing the world in, because this straight logic way of looking at things doesn't seem really to be fundamentally answering some of the bigger curiosities within us. And it also, some of the conclusions we've come to as a society, it doesn't seem to be making people crazy happy either. Like, or it's not like people have figured something out.
I would say, I probably need to make this clear. I'm not anti-science here from any of this.
No. But I think just and it doesn't sound like that way. And even just with your philosophy background and all that, I know you're not. I know you're not like like anti-education or nothing like this. But I do, like, just from someone who is personally explored with ayahuasca before, or meditates, or different things, like, it's just interesting. And even, as I mentioned to you, fasted last week just to experience an altered state. I wanted to experience the world from a different perspective, like from someone that needed to move slowly throughout my day, from someone that didn't have energy. Did you get me?
No, totally. And I think that is, I think we're converging on a point here, which is that there are multiple ways of knowing and experiencing the world. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I like is, and I'm trying to bring this back, is we have we have the archaic phrase in English, that is beyond our ken, or when you find something is beyond your ken, and ken, and the German kennen, relate to that knowing, which is not the rational knowing, right?
Yeah.
And what I think we're both sort of seeking in altering our consciousness is to experience the kenning as well as the rational knowledge.
Yeah, and not in some like directly like sequential thing of integrating them both, but integrating my knowledge in different fields to
Yeah.
something that feels something more representative or aligned with the natural the subtle pulsings
Yeah.
of the world and the things that most people aren't paying attention to. There's something you said at the very start, though, in terms that I wanted to go back to, and even just how that maybe is even aligned with this in this curiosity. But you mentioned at the start of almost experiencing a burnout of trying to be as normal as possible, or availing of the opportunity to be like in such a normal
Yeah.
situation, and the inherent struggles within that. What released you from that almost pattern of orientating towards that?
For me, it was the realization that it would kill me. Eventually, it would shorten my
Right.
life, and it would kill me. And I didn't want to die. I didn't want to die in like that. I didn't want to
Yeah.
die spending the rest of my days trying to pursue a goal that I fundamentally had realized I would never, ever, ever even come close to. It's not even about, oh, you'll try, but you'll never get there. I was like, I'm never going to be good enough to qualify. I'm never going to cross the
Right.
line to match that. I'm always going to be this, whatever this is, in a complex. So I went, okay, if that's the case, I really should study what this is. Right? And I think everybody has that choice, that moment in their life when they're like, I have all these dreams and hopes, and I could either kill myself trying to get them, and achieve them, and then be like, whoa, that's 40 years of my life gone.
Right.
Or I could go, maybe there's another way. Maybe I can achieve a similar sort of sensation, a similar sort of good life by studying where I am now, rather than constantly looking to a future or an ideal. And I think that's one of the biggest moments is when you realize you're always going to be there. Even if you succeed, you're always going to be there, right? Like, even if you become the billionaire, the VC founder, whatever, you're always going to be there. You can't escape from yourself, right?
Yeah.
So why not learn that self in the most rooted, most detailed, most intimate way possible? And then when you've started doing that, maybe your goals will shift. Or maybe you'll be like, yeah, actually, I don't want to be like the billionaire. What I actually want is just enough to eat and enough to go and do this. And you suddenly realize, maybe I don't have to work out those 40-hour weeks or those, 10-day things. And maybe this whole idea that I should is kind of an insulation from myself, right? And I think a lot of people, I mean, I'll argue and sort of agree with Bio on this one, that the human is an insulation project, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm lucky, and I do say lucky, because my disability has meant that insulation has never been, like, I've never been fully wrapped in the bubble wrap, right?
That's that's a beautiful expression. This insulation from themselves. I I almost think this. Sometimes people's achievements, they're almost an edifice to the void that exists within them.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I love this sense as well of, and it's happened for me in terms of my goal. The more I go inside and investigate myself, there's pretty substantial and obvious ways in which I'm showing up differently in the world
Mm,
outside of me, and how I'm, what I'm striving for or letting go of or not striving for.
mm.
It's there's something really magical to the
Oh, yeah.
experience.
And I think once you study yourself, you begin to notice and can take stock of your resources better, right? This is one thing
Yeah,
that, you mentioned the pulses of the world earlier, and our bodies pulse as well, but our energy levels, they ebb and flow. They're cyclic. They're not linear, right? And for many people with disabilities, they might be able to say, oh, I don't know whether I'm going to have the energy to do that next week or even tomorrow, right? Because your energy levels fluctuate. So you go with you begin to study the rhythms of your own energy levels, right? And you start to go, what is the most effective thing that I can do with the minimal amount of energy, right?
yeah,
And this is the big thing. When you look at activism, you look at all these big movements, they cost a lot of energy, right? And can accelerate exhaustion. And what I'm trying to hint at, because it's different for everyone, is there are movements, there are ways that are low energy that mean you can do more while appearing to do less,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the only way you learn that is by studying yourself. And when you get to a point of studying yourself, your own body, your own mind, you start to realize I'm also composed of others. So it's also not just studying me, it's studying your environment. It's studying where you live. It's studying, if you go on walks, which walks energize you, which walks, exhaust you more, which experiences are beneficial, which experiences drain you of your vitality. And this is one of those things where my primary metaphor is vitality, right? Because vitality is not just physical strength. It is not just energy. It is about how much you embrace life, whatever the life
yes,
is. And
yeah,
once
yeah,
you embrace that life, you become vital in whatever form your life is. So if you're in a hospital bed and you can't move, but you've embraced life enough that you are, although you can't write hundreds of words, the tens of words that you are writing are filled with life. And over 6 months, you manage to get an essay out or a piece out, and it affects people. Bang! You've done that. And people pick up on the vitality of it.
I think this is I think this is so important. I've actually written about this before. The sense of aliveness which we feel in our lives. I think
Yeah.
is, we've talked earlier about comfort being something that people are seeking, and
Mm.
of course comfort at times is wonderful as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Whatever
Well, I'm
people,
not dissing comfort at all. I'm not
no,
dissing,
no, no,
it's good
no,
to
no.
it's good to sink into a good, comfortable, chair and
Absolutely, and it wasn't taken that way. But you know, the I think the thing that we're sometimes missing, and sometimes when we're over-indexed or overweighted in our pursuit
mm,
of comfort, we're missing out on this sense of aliveness, which I think is, it's something that when one deeply connects with themselves and the world around them, or even integrates or infuses with the world around them, there's an aliveness that doesn't always bring a predictability, but you can feel it off people. And I think it's such a rich quality in terms of someone experiencing their own personal good life, I guess.
And I think one of the interesting things about that is it ties in quite neatly with, again, something that bio often says is it's about becoming lost.
Yeah.
It's about engaging with not knowing what's going on and wondering about it and not holding to anything fixed. I wonder what the tree is doing. I wonder what that painting in the back of Mark's window there is doing. And it appears my cat has come to visit. So, yep, there we go. There's the other. Please don't close the browser on me. That would be bad. But yes, this is one of the others in my existence that influences my life. But yes,
for anyone listening at the moment, Craig's cat has just climbed up in between ourselves and the camera.
Yep.
But that's I think that's a lovely thing, though, isn't it? Just this life being this kind of emergent piece, and things popping up and falling into acceptance in them. And at the start of the conversation, you were referring to, you're wondering what people are missing in their perspective, what people are missing even in their perspective of this idea of a normal life, not wasting energy anymore in terms of, trying to fit a certain definition of something like that.
Yeah.
You always said later on that almost killed you. Like, then this deeper curiosity that you're experiencing in terms of, are there other ways of being, paying attention to the subtleties? Like, someone lying on a bed could say, somebody could say they're doing nothing, but no, there's lots going on in that.
Yeah.
And just the different levels of energy that we can all exert, and just trying to appreciate whatever your experience of life is.
Yeah.
And then even, talking about a deeper inquiry using things like meditation, magic, the occult, then also even just having outlets for this curiosity, whether, I know you're saying you're a recovering philosopher, but or a philosophy studier of philosophy, but then also this sense of writing as well, and the importance of that. And when you mentioned even, writing something and capturing something, and the vitality that brings you as well, this sense of vitality, vitality isn't just this label that means a set experience for one person. It's a sense of aliveness that someone feels in their own life. I think you mentioned so many kind of enriching things for people to consider in terms of an appreciation and awareness of their own lives, and trying to perhaps maybe try to get for people to explore things in different ways, look at things in different ways. Just in everything, I've really enjoyed everything you've shared throughout this conversation, Greg. But just to ask you the explicit question I always ask people at the end of the conversation, what is a good life for you, Craig?
A good life is one that allows you to live in the most maximal way possible, to embrace the aliveness in every single circumstance, and to know that shifts, changes, pulses, and rhythms are more and more fundamental to us than we ever really realize. And maybe, just maybe, we might want to risk de-insulating ourselves a little bit.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautifully put. And I love this idea of not trying to almost like contain life, but just pay attention to the shifting vibrations, pulses, seasons, movements.
It all overflows, and the cup runneth over, as they say.
Yeah. Craig, look, Thank you so much for taking the time to join
Pleasure,
us
Mark.
today on the What
Pleasure.
is a Good Life podcast. I've really enjoyed the conversation and your company, and I look forward to us connecting again
All
soon.
right. Take care.
Thanks for watching the latest clip from the What is a Good Life podcast. My name's Mark McCartney. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also a coach based in Berlin. Over the last 2 years, I've interviewed over 150 people around this question, and I've distilled these findings, anecdotes, and experiences into both corporate workshops and one-on-one coaching programs. If you're a corporate looking to book a workshop for your next event, or you're a working professional in need of finding answers to some of the bigger questions in life, please direct message me below for a free 30-minute consultation.